The fog clung to Clara Hensley like a shroud as she stumbled through the pine-whispering woods, her boots slipping on frost-slick roots. A low growl rumbled behind her, too close, vibrating through the ancient pines that loomed like silent sentinels in the mist. Her heart thundered against her ribs, her auburn hair plastered to her sweat-damp forehead as she clutched her worn denim jacket tighter. She'd ventured too deep this time, past the boundary the old folks of Willow Hollow swore never to cross. Something was out there, stalking her through the haze, its golden eyes glinting like fireflies in the gloom. She couldn't turn back now, not with what she'd heard. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The morning had begun quietly enough, with the late spring sun barely piercing the thick canopy of pine-whispering woods. Clara Hensley, a woman in her mid-20s with a wild mane of auburn hair and emerald-green eyes that burned with quiet determination, had set out from her stone house at the edge of Willow Hollow, West Virginia. The air carried the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth, a familiar comfort to her as she trudged along the narrow deer trails she knew by heart. She had always been drawn to these woods, ever since she was a girl trailing after her mother, Lillian, to gather herbs for salves and teas. But today wasn't about herbs. Today something had called her deeper, a pull she couldn't name, tugging at her soul like a thread caught on a splinter. The townsfolk had their warnings, of course, passed down through generations in hushed tones over kitchen tables and church pews. "Don't go past the old oak when the fog rolls in," they'd say, their voices edged with the kind of fear that lingered in the lines of their weathered faces. The pines whisper things, secrets older than the mountains. Clara had heard it all her life, from the gray-haired widows who quilted on porches, to the grizzled hunters who claimed the woods swallowed men whole. She'd nodded politely, her lips curving into a half-smile, but she'd never been one to heed such talk, not when there were creatures out there. Foxes with broken legs, birds with tattered wings, that needed her hands to mend them. Her grandmother had called it a gift, that knack for healing. Her mother had called it a calling. Clara just called it who she was. But this morning the woods felt different. The fog had come sudden and heavy, blanketing the forest in a gray veil that muffled every sound save the crunch of frost-covered leaves beneath her boots. The pines stretched upward, their needle-laden branches weaving a ceiling that blocked out the sky, leaving only slivers of pale light to filter through. It was the kind of stillness that pressed against your chest, made you hold your breath for fear of breaking it. Even the birds, usually chattering from the treetops, had fallen silent, as if they too sensed something stirring in the shadows. Clara adjusted the leather satchel slung across her shoulder, the one her grandmother had stitched decades ago, its pockets stuffed with bandages and a tin of salve. She'd meant to check a snare she'd found last week, some poacher's careless trap that had snagged a raccoon she'd nursed back to health. But the deeper she went, the more that purpose faded. Her steps quickened, driven by an instinct she couldn't shake, a whisper in her blood that said, "Keep going." The old oak loomed ahead, its twisted roots clawing into the earth like the hands of some buried giant. It marked the edge of what the villagers called safe ground, a boundary few dared to cross. Clara paused, her breath fogging in the chill air, and brushed a hand against its rough bark. She'd always liked this tree, its stubborn endurance, its quiet strength. It reminded her of her parents, Henry and Lillian, who'd vanished in these very woods 3 winters past. leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and an ache she carried like a stone. That's when she heard it, a faint whimper, so soft it might have been the wind playing tricks. Clara froze, her ears straining against the silence. There it was again, sharper now, a sound that pierced the fog and set her pulse racing. She knew animal cries better than most, had spent years coaxing orphaned fawns and wounded owls back to life. But this was different. It wasn't just pain or hunger. It was something older, something pleading. She turned toward the sound, her boots sinking into the mossy earth as she pushed past a curtain of mist, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. There, in a hollow beneath the oak's gnarled roots, lay a sight that stole the breath from her lungs. A wolf pup, no bigger than a loaf of bread, trembled in the morning chill. Its fur was an unusual silver gray, shimmering faintly as if dusted with frost, and its eyes, those molten gold eyes, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. They weren't the eyes of a helpless creature. They held flecks of something darker, something almost knowing, like a secret buried deep and waiting to be unearthed. Clara knelt, her jacket brushing the damp ground, and reached out a trembling hand. "Where's your mama, little one?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thudding of her own heart. The forest held its breath. No rustle of leaves, no snap of twigs, no sign of a mother wolf prowling nearby. Just silence, heavy and expectant, pressing down on her shoulders. The pup whimpered again, weaker this time, and Clara's resolve hardened. She knew the rules of Willow Hollow. Wild animals stayed wild. Jacob, her best friend since they were kids chasing fireflies down by the creek, had drilled it into her head 100 times. "Nature's got its own way, Clara," he'd say, his dark eyes serious under his mop of chestnut hair. "We can't meddle with every struggling thing." But as she looked into those golden eyes, something passed between them. Something ancient, inexplicable, like a spark igniting a long-dormant flame. Her fingers brushed its fur, and a jolt raced up her arm, sharp and electric, as if she'd touched a live wire. The fog thickened around them, curling like smoke, and for a moment she thought she saw shapes moving in it, tall, shadowy figures that vanished when she blinked. Clara's breath caught, her mind reeling, but she couldn't pull away. With a gentleness born of years tending broken wings and matted fur, she scooped the pup into her arms, tucking it inside her jacket against her chest. Its rapid heartbeat synced with hers, a tiny drumbeat in the stillness, and she murmured, "Don't worry, I'll keep you safe." The words had barely left her lips when a sound rolled through the forest, a deep, resonant rumble, like thunder from a cloudless sky. The pines swayed, their branches creaking as if in protest, and Clara's stomach twisted. She turned toward home, the pup's warmth seeping through her shirt, and took a step, then another. The growl came again, closer now, and she glanced back, her eyes scanning the mist. Those golden glints flickered once more, just beyond the oak, watching her go. A crow's harsh caw split the air like a warning, and for a fleeting second the pup's eyes flashed, with something that looked almost like triumph. Clara quickened her pace, the weight of her choice settling over her like the fog itself. She didn't know what she'd set in motion, only that the woods had shifted beneath her feet, and there was no turning back. The path to Willow Hollow stretched ahead, the village's wooden walls a distant promise through the haze. Whatever this pup was, whatever it meant, she'd find out soon enough. For now she held it close, her boots crunching through the frost, and let the pines whisper their secrets behind her. The stone house at the edge of Willow Hollow stood like a sentinel against the encroaching dusk, its weathered walls bathed in the last amber light of a late spring day. Clara Hensley pushed open the heavy oak door, her boots leaving muddy smears on the threshold. The silver-gray wolf pup cradled against her chest. The air inside was cool and musty, tinged with the faint scent of dried lavender and sage from the herb garden, gone wild outside. She kicked the door shut behind her, her breath still uneven from the trek through pine-whispering woods, and let the silence of the old place wrap around her like a quilt. The pup's warmth seeped through her denim jacket, its tiny heartbeat a steady pulse against her own, a lifeline tethering her to the moment she'd made her choice. She crossed the creaking floorboards to the kitchen, where her mother's old quilting table sat beneath a dust-streaked window. It was a sturdy thing, its oak surface scarred, from years of Lillian's needlework now repurposed for Clara's makeshift veterinary station. She eased the pup onto it, her hands trembling slightly as she unzipped her jacket. The creature stretched, its silver fur catching the lamplight in a way that made it shimmer, like frost on a moonless night, or the ripple of a stream under starlight. Clara's breath caught. This wasn't right. Wolf pups didn't shimmer. They didn't move with the grace of a dancer, their limbs unfolding as if they'd rehearsed every motion. She stepped back, her emerald eyes narrowing, and wiped her palms on her jeans. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel, a relic from her grandmother's time, its brass hands frozen at 10 minutes past 3 since the day her parents vanished. 3 winters ago, Henry and Lillian Hensley had gone into the woods to gather rare herbs for a fever sweeping the valley. They'd never come back. No trace, no goodbye, just a void that swallowed Clara's questions and left her alone in this house, tending the garden they'd loved and the creatures they'd taught her to heal. She'd searched for them, of course, scouring the trails until her boots wore thin, but the pines had kept their secrets. Now, as she watched the pup shake out its coat, she wondered if those secrets were starting to unravel. "Where'd you come from, huh?" she murmured, her voice low and rough, the kind of tone she used to soothe a spooked deer. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a tin of salve and a rag, though she wasn't sure what she planned to do with them. The pup didn't look injured, just cold, maybe hungry. She rummaged in the pantry, finding a jar of goat's milk she kept for orphaned critters, and warmed it over the stove, adding a drizzle of honey like her mother used to. But when she offered it in a shallow bowl, the pup turned its golden eyes on her with a look that could have been disdain, its nose wrinkling as if insulted. Clara frowned, her fingers tightening around the bowl. "Fine then," she said, setting it aside. "Suit yourself." Her gaze drifted to the slab of venison she'd set out for tomorrow's stew, thawing in the counter. She hesitated, then sliced off a small piece, holding it out on her palm. The pup's reaction was lightning fast, teeth flashing whitey in the dim light, snatching the meat with a precision that sent a shiver down her spine. A drop of blood hit the table, spreading like a dark star against the pale wood, and the pup licked its muzzle with a tongue that seemed too long, too forked. Clara's hand shook as she stepped back, her mind racing. This wasn't a wolf, not really. She'd seen wolves before, scruffy, wild things with wary eyes and ragged coats. This was something else, something that didn't belong in the hollows of West Virginia. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The pup's ears twitched, its golden eyes narrowing as it sank lower on the table, suddenly still. Clara wiped her hands on her jeans again, her boots thudding against the floor as she crossed to the door. She cracked it open, peering into the twilight, and found Jacob Miller standing there, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His chestnut hair was tousled from the wind, his dark eyes shadowed with worry beneath the brim of his faded cap. At 16, a year older than Clara when her parents disappeared, he'd taken it upon himself to watch over her, a self-appointed guardian who showed up with firewood or a brace of rabbits whenever she forgot to eat. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "Ain't seen you since yesterday, and folks are talking about strange noises from the woods." Clara forced a smile, leaning against the door frame to block his view inside. "I'm fine, Jacob. Just got caught up checking a snare. You know how it is." The lie tasted sour on her tongue, but she couldn't explain. Not yet. Not when she didn't understand it herself. He frowned, shifting his weight, and that's when she noticed it. The silver pendant around his neck, a family heirloom shaped like a crescent moon glowing faintly in the dusk. It pulsed with a pale blue light, subtle but unmistakable, and Jacob's hand went to it instinctively, his fingers brushing the metal. "What's that smell?" he said, sniffing the air. "You cooking something?" "Just warming some milk," she said quickly, stepping back. "Come in if you want, but don't fuss. I'm tired." He hesitated, then followed her inside, his boots scuffing the floor. The moment he crossed the threshold, the pendant flared brighter, and the pup let out a low sound, half growl, half hum, that made the air shiver. Jacob froze, his eyes snapping to the table. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What in God's name is that?" She turned, and there it was. The pup staring at Jacob with those molten gold eyes, its silver fur rippling like water under the lamplight. Clara's stomach twisted. She'd wanted to keep this quiet, figure it out alone, but now the secret was out, spilling into the room like the blood on the table. Jacob stepped closer, his hand hovering near the pendant, and the light pulsed in time with the pup's breathing. "That ain't no wolf," he said, his tone hard. "My grandpa used to tell stories, things in the woods older than the hills. You shouldn't have brought it here." "It was hurt," Clara snapped, her voice sharper than she meant. "Or cold, or something. I couldn't leave it." "Nature's got rules, Clara," he shot back, echoing the words he'd said 100 times before. "You don't mess with what don't belong." But as he spoke, the pup's eyes met hers again, and that jolt raced through her once more, a connection she couldn't name, binding her to it like a thread pulled taut. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching longer across the walls, and Clara knew Jacob was right about one thing. This wasn't natural, but it was too late to turn back. She'd made her choice in the woods, and now the consequences were creeping closer, whispering through the pines outside. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying a faint howl that didn't sound like any wolf she'd ever heard. Jacob's pendant glowed brighter, and the pup's ears flattened, its gaze shifting to the window. Clara's heart thudded against her ribs. Whatever she'd brought home, it wasn't alone, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Night had fallen over Willow Hollow like a heavy blanket, the stars hidden behind a shroud of clouds that pressed down on the rooftops. Inside Clara Hensley's stone house, the lamplight flickered, casting jittery shadows across the walls, as the wind rattled the windows with a restless fury. The silver-gray wolf pup, or whatever it was, lay curled in the spare room, a nest of old blankets softening the hardwood floor where Clara had left it. She stood in the kitchen, her hands braced against the quilting table, staring at the spot where the blood had stained the wood. Jacob Miller had gone, reluctantly, after she'd promised to figure things out by morning. But the silence he'd left behind was louder than his warnings, filling the house with a weight she couldn't shake. She'd tried to clean the stain, scrubbing at it with a rag until her knuckles ached, but it lingered, dark and stubborn, like a mark she couldn't erase. The pup's eyes haunted her, those golden orbs with their knowing glint watching her every move as if it understood more than she did. Jacob's words echoed in her head. Things in the woods older than the hills. She'd laughed off his grandpa's tales as a kid, stories of shadows that walked like men, of voices in the pines that lured folks to their doom. But now, with the pup's strange grace and that electric jolt still tingling in her fingertips, those tales didn't seem so funny anymore. The wind howled louder, a mournful sound that seeped through the cracks in the walls, and Clara shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. She crossed to the window, peering out at the herb garden her mother had planted years ago. The sage and thyme swayed wildly, their silver-green leaves catching the faint glow of a crescent moon breaking through the clouds. Beyond the garden, the dark line of pine-whispering woods loomed, its pines swaying like they were whispering to each other, or to her. She pressed a hand to the glass, the cold biting her palm, and that's when she heard it, a scratching sound, soft but insistent, coming from the spare room. Her breath hitched. She turned, her boots scuffing the floor as she moved toward the sound, her heart thudding in her chest. The spare room door was ajar just as she'd left it, but the air felt heavier now, charged with something she couldn't name. She pushed the door open wider, the hinges creaking, and peered inside. The pup was awake, its golden eyes glinting in the dim light spilling from the kitchen. It scratched at the floorboards, its tiny claws leaving faint marks that formed patterns, swirls and lines that looked almost like writing, though Clara told herself that was impossible. "What are you up to, little one?" she whispered, stepping closer. The pup stopped, lifting its head to meet her gaze, and a low whimper escaped its throat, a sound that twisted her heart. She knelt beside it, her knees pressing into the hardwood, and reached out, hesitating only a moment before brushing her fingers against its fur. That jolt came again, sharper this time, racing up her arm and into her chest, and the room seemed to tilt. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching toward her like fingers, and the air grew cold enough to frost her breath. She yanked her hand back, her pulse racing, but the pup's eyes held her, steady and unblinking, as if it were waiting for something. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a new sound, a chorus of howls, faint but growing closer, weaving through the pines like a song. They weren't the rough, wild calls of wolves hunting in the hollows. These were different, layered with tones that sounded almost like words, speaking of loss and longing and something broken long ago. Clara's stomach twisted, a chill creeping up her spine. She stood backing toward the door when a sharp rap echoed through the house. 3 quick knocks, loud enough to make her jump. She spun around, her boots thudding as she hurried to the front door, her mind racing. Jacob wouldn't come back this late, not without calling first. She cracked the door open, the cold night air rushing in, and found Ruth Grayson standing there, her wiry frame bundled in a patched shawl. The old herb woman's rheumy eyes glinted under the brim of her bonnet, sharp despite her years, and her gnarled hands clutched a walking stick carved with symbols Clara had never understood. Ruth lived in a crooked cottage by the eastern gate, tending her own garden and selling salves to the townsfolk. A fixture in Willow Hollow, as old as the pines themselves. "Evenin', Clara," Ruth said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "Heard you was out in the woods today. Saw something strange last night, round your place." Clara's throat tightened. "What kind of strange?" she asked, stepping aside to let Ruth in, though part of her wanted to slam the door and bolt it shut. "Shadows," Ruth said, hobbling inside, her stick tapping the floor. "Tall ones, moving like men but not men. Dancing round your house under the moon. Thought you ought to know." She paused, her eyes flicking toward the spare room, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. "You bring something back with you, girl?" Clara forced a laugh, shaky and thin. "Just a pup I found, nothing to fuss over." But the lie felt flimsy, and Ruth's gaze sharpened, cutting through it like a blade. "Don't play me for a fool," Ruth said, her tone hard. "I knew your granny, rest her soul. She taught me things about the woods, about what hides in 'em. You feel it, don't you? That pull." Clara swallowed, her hands clenching at her sides. She wanted to deny it, to send Ruth away and pretend this was just another night. But the scratching started again, louder now, and the pup let out a cry, a high, keening sound that shook the windows in their frames. The howls outside answered, closer still, ringing through the hollow like a warning bell. Ruth's eyes widened, her grip tightening on her stick, and Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She stumbled back to the spare room, Ruth following slow and steady, and pushed the door wide. The pup was on its feet, its silver fur bristling, its golden eyes blazing with a light that wasn't natural. The scratches on the floor had deepened, forming shapes that twisted and shifted when Clara blinked. Symbols she didn't know but felt in her bones. The air crackled, cold and electric, and the pup's cry rose again, a sound that belonged to no wolf, no creature of these woods. It was a call, ancient and wild, and the shadows on the walls danced in response, stretching into forms that made Clara's eyes water. Ruth grabbed her arm, her fingers digging in. "You've woke something, Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "Something older than us, older than this town. Your granny warned me this day might come." Clara's mind spun, her breath coming in short gasps as the howls outside grew deafening, a chorus of voices that spoke of broken bonds and worlds long sealed. She looked at the pup. No, the thing. And saw it for what it was. A key, a spark, a door she'd unwittingly opened. The room shook, dust falling from the rafters, and her dreams from the night before flooded back. Golden eyes expanding into a starry void, pulling her toward something vast and unknowable. She didn't know what it meant, not yet. But as the wind battered the house and the shadows closed in, Clara knew one thing for certain. She'd brought more than a pup into Willow Hollow. She'd brought a reckoning, and it was only just beginning. Dawn broke over Willow Hollow with a reluctant glow, the sun struggling to pierce the thick shroud of clouds that hung low over the pines. Inside Clara Hensley's stone house, the air was frigid despite the late spring warmth outside, a chill that seeped into the bones of the old place and settled there like an uninvited guest. Clara stood at the threshold of the spare room, her breath fogging in the dim light, her auburn hair tangled from a sleepless night haunted by dreams of golden eyes and whispering shadows. The scratching had stopped hours ago, replaced by a deep, rhythmic breathing that seemed too loud for the tiny wolf pup she'd left in there. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, the brass cold enough to sting, and she hesitated, Ruth Grayson's words echoing in her mind. "You've woke something, Clara. Something older than us." She'd sent Ruth home after the old woman's cryptic warning, promising to handle whatever this was alone. But alone felt heavier now, the silence pressing against her chest like a stone. The howls from the woods had faded with the night, leaving only the memory of their eerie song, a chorus of voices that spoke of things long buried. Clara's fingers tightened around the knob, her heart thudding against her ribs, and she pushed the door open with a slow, creaking groan. The sight that greeted her stole the air from her lungs, rooting her boots to the floorboards as a wave of cold dread washed over her. Where the silver-gray pup should have been stood a creature that defied every law of nature she'd ever known. It towered over the nest of blankets, its form stretched to the size of a young horse, its fur a rippling tapestry of silver and midnight blue that moved like the northern lights across its body. The head was no longer a wolf's. Its muzzle had elongated, filled with rows of crystalline teeth that glowed with an inner light, sharp and jagged like shards of glass. And its eyes, those molten gold eyes, had multiplied, spreading across its face like a constellation, each one blinking independently, holding depths that made Clara's knees tremble. It stood on hind legs with an unnatural grace, its shadow stretching up the wall, twisting into shapes that flickered and shifted. Human one moment, beast the next, then something else entirely. Clara stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the doorframe, a gasp escaping her lips. The creature turned its many-eyed gaze upon her, and the room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with a metallic tang like a storm brewing inside the walls. She wanted to run, to scream, but her feet wouldn't move, pinned by those eyes that saw through her, into her, past her, to something ancient buried in her blood. The jolt she'd felt in the woods came again, unbidden, surging through her when she hadn't even touched it, and she clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The front door slammed open behind her, the sound jolting her from her stupor, and Jacob Miller burst into the house, his boots pounding the floor. His dark eyes widened as he skidded to a stop beside her, his chestnut hair damp with morning dew, his silver pendant blazing with a light so bright it illuminated the room in a cold, blue glow. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I heard it from the ridge. What the hell is that thing?" She couldn't answer, her throat too tight, her mind reeling. Jacob stepped in front of her, his hand gripping the pendant as if it were a weapon, his broad frame a shield between her and the creature. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice trembled. Grandpa's stories, shadow walkers he called 'em. Beings sealed away by the old folks when the hollow was new. You've gone and let one loose. The creature tilted its head, its crystalline teeth glinting, and a low sound emerged from its throat. Not a growl, not a howl, but something in between. A vibration that made the windows rattle and the floorboards hum. Clara's skin prickled, the cold deepening until frost crept across the walls in intricate patterns, curling like vines or runes she couldn't read. She pushed past Jacob, her fear giving way to a stubborn resolve, and faced the creature, her hands clenched at her sides. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why'd you come to me?" It didn't speak, not with words, but she felt its answer, a rush of sensations flooding her mind, the ache of exile, the weight of centuries spent waiting, the splintering of something vast into fragments scattered across the world. Images flickered behind her eyes, crystalline cities beneath alien skies, beings of shadow and starlight dancing in a realm lost to time. She staggered, her hand grasping the doorframe for support, and Jacob caught her arm, his pendant pulsing in time with the creature's breathing. "Clara, get away from it," he hissed, pulling her back. But she shook him off, her emerald eyes locked on the creature's golden ones. "I touched it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the woods, I felt it then, too, like it knew me." The memory of that jolt, that binding spark burned through her. And she knew Jacob couldn't understand, not yet. The creature lowered itself slightly, its shadow shrinking, and for a moment she thought she saw something like recognition in its gaze, something tender beneath the terror. The air crackled and the frost patterns spread faster, climbing the walls like a living thing. Jacob's pendant flared again, and he yanked her toward the kitchen, his grip bruising. "We gotta get out. Tell the elders, something ain't right here," he said, his eyes darting to the creature. But before they could move, a sound split the air, a cry from the creature, sharp and piercing, that shook the house to its foundations and sent a jolt through Clara's spine. The windows vibrated, the glass trembling, as if it might shatter. And outside, the pines answered with a rustling roar, their branches bending toward the house like they were listening. Clara's knees buckled and she sank to the floor, her hands pressing against the cold wood. The creature stepped forward, its claws clicking against the boards. And Jacob shouted something she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. The frost reached her fingers, tracing patterns that felt alive, and she realized with a sickening lurch that this wasn't just a creature. It was a doorway, a key to something bigger than Willow Hollow, something she'd unlocked with a single act of kindness. The howls from the night before echoed in her memory, and she knew they weren't alone. Whatever this was, it had kin, and they were coming. Midday sun filtered weakly through the clouds over Willow Hollow, casting long shadows across the dirt streets as whispers spread like wildfire among the townsfolk. Clara Hensley sat on the kitchen floor of her stone house, her back against the quilting table, her hands still tingling from the frost that had crept across the spare room. The creature, Jacob's shadow walker, stood motionless now, its towering form filling the doorway to the spare room, its many golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Jacob paced beside her, his boots scuffing the floor, his pendant glowing steadily, a beacon in the dimness. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them broken only by the faint creak of the house settling under its new, unearthly weight. Clara's mind churned, piecing together fragments, the pup's transformation, Ruth's warning, the howls that had shaken the night. She'd brought this thing home thinking it was just another stray needing her help, but it was more, something ancient, something tied to the woods her parents had vanished into. Jacob stopped pacing, crouching beside her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You gotta tell me what's going on, Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That thing, it ain't natural. And you're acting like you're part of it." She shook her head, her auburn hair falling into her eyes. "I don't know what it is," she said, her voice hoarse. "But when I touched it, in the woods, and again just now, it's like it knows me, like it's been waiting." She couldn't explain the jolt, the flood of images that weren't hers, the sense of being bound to it by something deeper than blood. Jacob's jaw tightened, his hand brushing the pendant, and she saw the fear in him, the same fear she'd felt at dawn, now warring with a stubborn need to understand. Before he could respond, the creature spoke, not with a voice she heard with her ears, but one that resonated in her bones, a chorus of tones that wove together like wind through a crystal cave. "Daughter of the old blood," it said, and Clara's breath caught, her hands clenching into fists. "You have broken the seal with your heart's choice. We are freed, and the worlds draw near once more." The words carried a weight that pressed against her chest, a truth she couldn't deny, and the frost patterns on the walls flared brighter, glowing with a pale, otherworldly light. Jacob shot to his feet, his pendant blazing. "What the hell does that mean?" he demanded, stepping toward the creature, but Clara grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Let it finish." She didn't know why she trusted it, not fully, but those golden eyes held no malice, only a strange, ancient patience that made her want to listen. The creature's head tilted, its crystalline teeth glinting as it continued. "Long ago we were bound, scattered into forms of the wild, waiting for one with the blood of the keepers to show compassion over fear. You, Clara Hensley, have fulfilled the prophecy." The air shimmered, and outside a low rumble shook the earth, drawing shouts from the street. Clara staggered to her feet, her heart pounding, and stumbled to the window, Jacob close behind. Through the glass they saw them, shapes emerging from pine-whispering woods, tall and fluid, their silver-blue forms shifting between shadow and light as they moved toward the town. Panic erupted in Willow Hollow. Doors slammed open. Voices rose in alarm, and Clara's stomach twisted as she recognized the creatures, kin to the one in her house, their golden eyes glinting in the midday haze. Jacob cursed under his breath, his hand gripping her shoulder. "You did this," he said, not accusing but stunned. "You let him out." I didn't mean to," she whispered, her eyes wide as the town awoke to the impossible. The front door burst open again, and Elder Margaret Cole stormed in, her gray hair wild, her arms clutching a bundle of ancient scrolls yellowed with age. The village leader's face was pale, her sharp eyes darting from Clara to the creature, then back again. "Clara Hensley," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "what have you brought upon us?" Clara opened her mouth to answer, but the creature's voice filled the room again, drowning her out. "The seals are broken," it said, its tones echoing through the walls. "The barrier's thin, and we seek our home. She is the key, the bridge." Margaret's scrolls trembled in her hands, and she unrolled one with shaking fingers, her lips moving as she read the faded ink. "When kindness breaks the seal of old," she murmured, her voice rising, "a choice of worlds will then unfold, one soul to bridge the ancient way, so others might return to stay." Jacob's pendant flared brighter, and he turned to Clara, his eyes wide with realization. "Your parents," he said, his voice barely audible over the growing clamor outside. "They didn't just disappear, did they? They found one of these things, tried to keep it locked away." The pieces clicked into place, sharp and painful. Henry and Lillian lost in the woods, not dead but caught in some act of sacrifice to hold the seals her ancestors had forged. Clara's knees buckled, and she sank against the table, her mind reeling. "They're alive?" she asked, her voice breaking, and the creature's many eyes softened, swirling with something like sorrow. "They sought to bind us," it said, "to maintain the walls between worlds." But the seals were failing, and they became trapped, neither here nor there, but between. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, her chest tightening with a mix of hope and horror. Margaret stepped forward, her scrolls clutched tight. "This is the prophecy," she said, her tone grim. "The old blood, the keeper's line. Your family, Clara. And now you've undone what they died to protect." Her words stung, but Clara shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I didn't mean to break anything," she said, her voice rising. I couldn't leave it there, hurtin' in the woods." The ground trembled again, and through the window Clara saw the shadow walkers drawing closer, their forms casting long shadows over the houses. Villagers gathered in the street, their faces pale with recognition, of tales their grandparents had told, of a time when things far stranger than wolves roamed these hills. Jacob grabbed her arm, his pendant pulsing like a frantic heartbeat. "We gotta figure this out, Clara," he said, his voice urgent. "They're comin', and I don't know what they want." But Clara did, or she was starting to. The creature's words, its images, the pull she'd felt since the woods, they all pointed to her, to a choice she hadn't known she was making. The frost on the walls glowed brighter, and the air shimmered with cracks, rifts in reality itself, flickering with glimpses of crystalline spires and starlit skies. She looked at the shadow walker, its golden eyes reflecting her own, and felt the weight of destiny settling over her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she was at the heart of it, and Willow Hollow would never be the same. Twilight draped Willow Hollow in a soft violet haze, the sun sinking behind the jagged peaks of the Appalachians as shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt streets. Inside Clara Hensley's stone house, the air shimmered with an otherworldly glow, the cracks in reality flickering like fireflies against the walls, glimpses of crystalline spires and starlit skies bleeding through from a realm beyond. The shadow walker stood in the spare room doorway, its towering form a tapestry of silver and midnight blue, its constellation of golden eyes fixed on Clara with a patience that felt eternal. She stood in the kitchen, her auburn hair catching the strange light, her emerald eyes wide with a mix of awe and dread. Jacob Miller hovered beside her, his silver pendant pulsing faintly, while elder Margaret Cole clutched her ancient scrolls, her gray hair wild in the rising wind that rattled the windows. The village outside buzzed with fear and wonder, voices rising over the creak of doors and the shuffle of boots as folks gathered to gawk at the shadow walkers emerging from pine-whispering woods. Their fluid forms moved like liquid starlight, casting eerie shadows that danced across the clappered houses, and Clara felt their presence like a hum in her bones, a call she couldn't ignore. The creature's words still echoed in her mind. "You are the bridge," a prophecy fulfilled, a seal broken by your kindness, and now a choice that loomed over her like the mountains themselves. Margaret unrolled another scroll, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "One soul to bridge the ancient way, so others might return to stay." It's you, Clara, your blood, your heart. But this ain't something we can let happen. These things, they don't belong here. Her sharp eyes darted to the shadow walker, her hands tightening around the parchment as if it could shield them from the truth. Jacob stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense, his pendant glowing brighter. "She's right," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "We don't know what they'll do. Tear this town apart, maybe worse. You gotta send it back, Clara, whatever it takes." His dark eyes pleaded with her, a mix of fear and loyalty that twisted her gut. He'd been her rock since her parents vanished, chopping wood for her stove, sitting with her through the long nights when the silence got too loud. But he didn't feel what she did, the pull, the connection, the spark that had bound her to the creature since the woods. Clara shook her head, her hands clenching at her sides. "I can't just undo it," she said, her voice cracking. "It's not that simple. They're not here to hurt us. It said they want to go home." She turned to the shadow walker, its golden eyes swirling with depths she couldn't fathom. "Ain't that right? You're not here to destroy us. You're just trying to get back where you belong." The creature's head tilted, its crystalline teeth catching the light as its voice filled the room. Not spoken, but felt, a chorus of tones that vibrated through her bones. "We are exiles," it said, "bound by your ancestors to this world, scattered into forms of the wild. We seek return, but the way requires a bridge, a willing soul to span the realms. You, daughter of the old blood, have opened the path. Now you must choose, stand as our bridge and guide us home, or refuse and let the barriers shatter on their own." Clara's breath hitched, her mind reeling as images flooded her again, crystalline cities, shadow beings dancing beneath alien moons, a longing so deep it ached in her chest. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The creature's eyes darkened, flecks of white light dancing within them like distant stars. "The seals are broken beyond repair. Without a bridge, the worlds will bleed together. Chaos will consume both, a tearing of reality itself. Your parents sought to prevent this, but their strength could only delay it. You hold the power to mend what they could not." Jacob grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Don't listen to it, Clara. It's tricking you, saying what you want to hear about your folks. We'll find another way. Margaret's got them scrolls. We'll figure something out." His voice cracked, betraying the fear he tried to hide, and Clara saw the boy who'd stood by her through every storm, now facing one who he couldn't fight. But Margaret shook her head, her face grim. "The scrolls don't lie," she said, her tone heavy with resignation. "The prophecy's clear. Only one with the old blood can bridge the worlds. Your granny knew it, Clara. She was a keeper, same as your folks. They tried to hold the seals, and it trapped 'em. You're all that's left." The room spun, and Clara sank against the table, her hands pressing into the stained wood where the pup's blood had fallen. Her parents, Henry and Lillian, alive, trapped between worlds, their sacrifice undone by her kindness. She'd thought she was saving a life, not breaking a seal, not tearing open a door her family had died to keep shut. The weight of it crushed her, a stone on her chest she couldn't lift, and tears stung her eyes as she looked at the shadow walker. "What happens to me if I do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If I'm your bridge?" The creature stepped closer, its claws clicking against the floor, and the air shimmered brighter, the cracks widening to reveal more of that crystalline realm, spires that touched diamond dust clouds, gardens blooming with light. "You will become more than mortal," it said, its voice softening with something like reverence. "A bridge lives in both worlds, a conduit of compassion and power. You may come with us, see wonders no human has witnessed in 10,000 years, or stay and anchor the way from here, but the choice must be yours, freely given." A sharp rap at the door interrupted them, and Clara turned as Ruth Grayson hobbled in, her shawl flapping in the wind, her rheumy eyes sharp with purpose. "I felt it comin'," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your granny trained me for this, Clara. Taught me the signs, the herbs, the songs. She knew one day the old blood'd be called. You're ready, even if you don't see it yet. Clara stared at Ruth, memories flooding back. Her grandmother humming over the garden, showing her how to read the sky in the shadows of the pines, telling her compassion was the strongest magic of all. She thought they were just stories, lessons to pass the time, but now they clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle she'd never known she was solving. The cracks in reality pulsed, the shadow walkers outside drawing nearer, and Clara felt the pull stronger than ever, a thread tying her to her parents, to the woods, to the creature before her. "I need time," she said, her voice steadying, but the creature shook its head, its eyes swirling with urgency. "Time thins with the barriers," it said. "Choose now, or the choice will be made for you." The ground trembled, a low rumble that rattled the dishes in the cupboard, and Clara saw it through the window. A tear in the sky, jagged and glowing, spilling light that wasn't earthly. Her heart raced, her mind torn between fear and the echo of her grandmother's voice. Kindness is the oldest magic. She closed her eyes, the weight of Willow Hollow, her parents, and two worlds pressing down on her, and knew there was no turning back. Whatever she chose, it would change everything, and she wasn't sure she was ready to lose herself to it. Night fell over Willow Hollow with a sudden starless weight, the sky swallowed by clouds that churned with an unnatural glow. Inside, Clara Hensley's stone house, the air crackled with energy, the cracks in reality blazing bright enough to cast the room in a shimmering twilight. The Shadow Walker loomed in the spare room doorway, its silver-blue form nearly touching the ceiling, its golden eyes a constellation of light that bore into Clara with quiet expectation. She stood at the center of the kitchen, her auburn hair wild in the rising wind that seeped through the walls, her emerald eyes blazing with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Jacob Miller gripped her shoulder, his pendant pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, while Elder Margaret Cole and Ruth Grayson flanked her, their faces etched with awe and fear. The village outside trembled, the ground shaking as more shadow walkers gathered, their fluid forms converging on Clara's house like moths to a flame. Their golden eyes glinted through the windows, their shadows stretching across the herb garden, and the townsfolk's shouts faded into a distant hum, drowned by the roar of the pines bending toward the house. Clara's choice hung in the air, heavy and inevitable, a thread pulled taut between her past and a future she couldn't yet see. She'd asked for time, but time was a luxury the thinning barriers wouldn't grant, and the Shadow Walker's words, "Choose now or the choice will be made for you," rang in her ears like a tolling bell. "I'll do it," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, steady and clear despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll be your bridge, but I've got conditions." The words spilled out before she could second-guess them, born of a strength she'd inherited from her grandmother, honed by years of mending broken wings and soothing frightened hearts. The Shadow Walker's eyes swirled with curious light, and the room stilled, the cracks in reality pausing as if the very fabric of existence held its breath. "Speak your terms, daughter of the old blood," the creature said, its chorus of voices resonating through the walls, soft yet commanding. Jacob tightened his grip, his breath hitching, but he didn't interrupt, not yet. Clara straightened, her boots planted firm against the floorboards. "First," she said, "my parents, Henry and Lillian, you free 'em from wherever they're trapped and bring 'em home safe. Second, you share your healin' knowledge with this town, not all of it, but enough so we can care for our own, human and critter alike. And third, she took a deep breath, drawing on every lesson her grandmother had slipped into those quiet garden days. You leave a thread between our worlds, something we can call on in times of need, so we're never cut off completely. The Shadow Walker lowered its massive head, its crystalline teeth glinting as it considered her words. The air thickened, charged with ancient energies that made the hairs on Clara's arms stand on end, and the frost patterns on the walls pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Jacob's pendant flared, its blue light spreading to illuminate the room, and Ruth stepped forward, her gnarled hands clutching her walking stick. "Smart girl," she muttered, her rheumy eyes glinting with approval. "Your granny'd be proud, bargaining with the old powers like that." Margaret's scrolls rustled in her hands, her voice sharp with doubt. "You're playing with fire, Clara. What if they don't keep their word?" But the Shadow Walker's gaze shifted to her, silencing her protest with a look that carried the weight of millennia. "Your terms are wise," it said, its voice softening with something like respect. "We accept. Your parents will return. Your village will learn. And a thread will remain. But we add this: you will bear a mark of our realm. A sign that you have walked between worlds and may do so again." Before Clara could respond, one of its golden eyes detached itself, floating like a star through the air. It settled on her forehead, a burning cold that flared warm in an instant, and she gasped as knowledge poured into her, names of stars, songs of crystal forest, the language of shadows weaving through her mind. The transformation began then, sudden and overwhelming. Clara's feet lifted from the floor, her body bending like light through a prism as ancient magics coursed through her veins. Her hair flowed upward, shifting from auburn to a river of copper and starlight, shimmering with an ethereal glow. Her skin prickled, patterns of frost and shadow dancing across it, runes and swirls that told stories older than the hills, glowing faintly in the dimness. Her eyes burned, and when she blinked, they shone with the same golden light as the Shadow Walker's, reflecting universes she'd never seen. She cried out, a sound of pain and wonder, and Jacob lunged forward, his pendant sinking with her energy, anchoring her as she changed. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice raw, but Ruth grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Let it happen," she said, her tone firm. "She's strong. She'll come through." Margaret clutched her scrolls tighter, her lips moving in a silent prayer, and the Shadow Walkers outside pressed closer, their forms merging into a ring of light and shadow around the house, their power focusing on Clara like sunlight through a lens. The cracks in reality stabilized, turning from jagged tears into proper portals, doorways that pulsed with controlled energy, their edges smooth and deliberate. Clara felt them through her new senses, a network of threads connecting her to both worlds, and she reached out instinctively, her consciousness expanding like ripples on a pond. The first Shadow Walkers began to move, their essence flowing through her like a river of dreams, silver and blue, starlight and shadow, crossing back to their home with a grace that stole her breath. She saw it all, the crystalline spires rising from diamond dust clouds, the gardens of light, the beings who danced between realms, and felt their gratitude, their relief, a balm against the ache of her transformation. The room trembled, and from one of the portals a pull tugged at her heart. A familiar presence, two souls caught in the space between. Clara focused, her golden eyes narrowing, and reached across the dimensions, her power wrapping around them like strands of starlight. Henry and Lillian Hensley stumbled into the kitchen, materializing in a burst of frost and shadow, their faces frozen in the moment they disappeared 3 winters ago. Henry's dark hair was streaked with ice, Lillian's healing bag still slung at her side, and they blinked, disoriented as the solid ground steadied beneath their feet. "Clara," Lillian whispered, her voice breaking as she took in her daughter's transformed form, hair like starlight, skin etched with glowing runes. Henry reached for her, his hand trembling, but stopped short, awe and fear warring in his eyes. "What have you done, darlin'?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "She's saved us," the Shadow Walker said, its form shimmering as it spoke for her. "And mended what you could not." Clara sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the transformation settled, her body hers yet more, human and otherworldly, a bridge forged in compassion. Jacob knelt beside her, his pendant dimming, his hand on her back a silent promise of support. Ruth and Margaret watched in silence, the weight of history shifting beneath their feet. Outside, the portals glowed softly, the shadow walkers crossing through in a steady stream, and Clara felt the thread she'd demanded, a lifeline between worlds, humming with possibility. She'd chosen and the worlds had bent to her will, but as she looked at her parents, alive and whole, she wondered what she'd lost in the gaining and what Willow Hollow would become in the shadow of her choice. Dawn crept over Willow Hollow with a hesitant light, the first rays of sun filtering through the pines to touch a town forever changed. Inside Clara Hensley's stone house, the air still hummed with the fading echoes of ancient magic, the portals, now stable doorways between worlds, casting a soft, crystalline glow across the weathered floorboards. Clara knelt in the kitchen, her transformed body trembling with exhaustion and wonder. Her hair a flowing river of copper and starlight, her skin etched with glowing patterns of frost and shadow. Before her stood Henry and Lillian Hensley, her parents, materialized from the void between realms, their faces etched with the strain of 3 lost winters. The Shadow Walker loomed in the spare room doorway, its silver-blue form shimmering as it watched, while Jacob Miller, Elder Margaret Cole, and Ruth Grayson stood in a silent semicircle, witnesses to a miracle none had dared hope for. Henry's dark hair, streaked with frost from that fateful night, hung lank over his weathered face, his hazel eyes wide with disbelief as he took in his daughter's golden gaze. Lillian's hands clutched her old healing bag, the leather worn but intact. Her auburn hair, once a mirror of Clara's, now dulled by time, her green eyes glistening with unshed tears. They'd stumbled into the room moments ago, pulled from the twilight prison by Clara's newfound power, their boots scuffing the floor as they adjusted to solid ground. The air between them crackled with unspoken years, a chasm of loss bridged in an instant, and Clara's heart thudded against her ribs, a frantic beat that drowned out the fading hum of the portals. "Clara," Lillian whispered again, her voice breaking as she reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the frost-patterned skin of her daughter's cheek. The touch was tentative, as if she feared Clara might dissolve like a dream, but it grounded her, warm and real against the cold of her transformation. "My girl, what have you become?" Clara's throat tightened, tears spilling down her face as she grasped her mother's hand, pressing it harder against her cheek. "I'm still me, Mama," she said, her voice raw with emotion, though it echoed with a resonance that wasn't wholly human. I couldn't let you stay gone." She turned to Henry, her golden eyes pleading for understanding. and saw the awe in his gaze shift to something softer, something broken and mended all at once. Henry sank to his knees beside her, his calloused hands cupping her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Darlin'," he said, his voice rough with the weight of 3 years trapped between worlds. "We tried to keep 'em sealed, thought it'd protect you, protect the hollow. But you found a way we couldn't." His eyes flicked to the shadow walker, then back to her, and a faint smile tugged at his lips, weary but proud. "You're stronger than we ever were." The shadow walker spoke then, its chorus of voices gentle yet resonant, filling the room like a hymn. "She has healed the breach," it said, its golden eyes swirling with gratitude. "Where you sought walls, she built a bridge. Your daughter's compassion has freed you, and us." It stepped back, its form shimmering as more of its kin crossed through the portals, their silver-blue essence flowing like streams of light, back to their crystalline home. Clara rose shakily, her parents' hands steadying her, and the reunion crashed over her like a wave, tears and laughter mingling as they pulled her into their arms. She buried her face in Lillian's shoulder, breathing in the faint scent of sage and earth that clung to her mother's coat, a smell she'd thought lost forever. Henry's arms wrapped around them both, his grip fierce, as if he could hold back the years they'd missed. Jacob watched from a step away, his pendant dimmin' to a soft glow, his dark eyes glistening with relief. He'd been her anchor through those empty winters, and now he gave her this moment, a silent promise that he'd still be there when the dust settled. But the reunion wasn't without its shadows. Clara pulled back, her golden eyes searching her parents' faces, and saw the lines etched deeper than they should be, the hollows in their cheeks from a time beyond time. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where were you?" Lillian's hand tightened around her healing bag, her gaze distant. "We found one of 'em," she said, nodding toward the shadow walker. "A fox cub, hurt in the snow. We took it in, tried to mend it, but it changed, just like yours. We knew the stories, your granny's tales about the keepers, the seals. We thought we could reinforce 'em, keep the worlds apart. Used every herb, every chant we knew." Her voice faltered and Henry picked up the thread, his tone heavy. "It fought us," he said, "and the woods, they twisted. One minute we were there, the next we were nowhere. Caught in a gray place, cold and still, like a heartbeat stopped. We saw you sometimes, Clara, through the haze, like looking through a window we couldn't break. We tried to get back, but the seals held us till you—" He stopped, his eyes dropping to her glowing skin, and Clara felt the weight of their sacrifice settle over her, heavier than the mountains. "You were trying to protect me," she said, her voice breaking, "and I undid it all." Guilt gnawed at her, sharp and cold, but Lillian shook her head, her hand squeezing Clara's. "No, darlin'," she said, her tone firm despite the tears. "You did what we couldn't. You found a way to heal it, not just hold it back. We're here 'cause of you." The words eased the ache, if only a little, and Clara clung to them, her parents' presence a balm against the strangeness of her new form. Outside, the portals pulsed softly, their light spilling into the herb garden, and the shadow walkers' exodus slowed, their numbers thinning as the last crossed through. Jacob stepped to the window, his breath fogging the glass, and murmured, "Town's quietin' down. They're scared, but they're watchin'. Reckon they'll want to know what's next." Margaret nodded, her scrolls tucked under her arm, her face softening as she looked at Clara. "You've given us a miracle," she said, her voice gruff but warm. "But it's a big one to swallow. We'll need time, and you, to figure this out." Ruth hobbled closer, her stick tapping the floor, and rested a hand on Clara's shoulder, her roomy eyes glinting with pride. "Your granny'd say you've done the keepers proud," she said. "This ain't the end. It's a beginnin'." Clara managed a small smile, her golden eyes flickering, and felt the thread she'd demanded. A faint hum connecting her to the Shadow Walker's realm. A lifeline she could sense even now. The Shadow Walker inclined its head, its form fading slightly as it prepared to join its kin. "The bridge is forged," it said, "and the worlds are balanced, for now." With that, it stepped through the nearest portal, vanishing in a ripple of light, leaving Clara with her family in a town on the cusp of something new. She looked at her parents, their hands in hers, and knew the hardest part was over, but the next steps, whatever they held, were just beginning. 5 years had passed since Clara Hensley became the bridge, and Willow Hollow bore the marks of that transformation like a quilt stitched with threads of both worlds. The late spring sun hung high over the Appalachian hills, casting golden light across a town no longer wholly earthly. Crystalline formations sprouted alongside the clapboard houses, their facets catching the sun in rainbows that danced over the dirt streets. The herb garden outside Clara's stone house bloomed with hybrid plants, sage entwined with glowing flowers from the Shadow Walker's realm, their petals chiming softly in the breeze. The portals, once chaotic rifts, stood as permanent fixtures at the town's edges, their edges smooth and glowing, doorways to a crystalline world that hummed with quiet life. Clara walked the garden path, her boots crunching on gravel dusted with frost despite the warmth, her hair a cascade of starlight that shimmered with every step. The golden mark on her forehead glowed faintly, a constant reminder of her bond to both realms, and her skin bore patterns of frost and shadow that shifted like living tattoos, subtle in daylight, radiant at dusk. She was still Clara, still the girl who'd nursed wounded critters and tended her mother's herbs. But she was more now, a bridge whose presence held the worlds in balance. Her golden eyes scanned the garden, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she bent to touch a crystalline bloom, its light pulsing under her fingers. Inside the house, Lillian bustled in the kitchen, her auburn hair tied back, her healing bag slung over a chair. She'd taken to blending Shadow Walker magic with her old herbal cures, crafting salves that mended broken bones in days and teas that soothed nightmares born of the woods. Henry sat at the quilting table, his dark hair graying at the temples, sketching maps of the portal's patterns. Work he'd begun to teach the younger folks how to maintain the balance Clara had forged. Their return had mended Clara's heart, but the years between worlds had left them changed, quieter, slower, their eyes carrying a distant sheen she couldn't reach. Still, they were here, and that was enough. The town had adapted too in ways Clara hadn't foreseen. Ruth Grayson's crooked cottage by the eastern gate had become a school of sorts, where she taught a handful of young healers, girls with bright eyes and boys with calloused hands, how to weave earthly herbs with the Shadow Walker's light. Her gnarled fingers guided them through the motions, her voice raspy but firm as she echoed lessons Clara's grandmother had once shared. "Feel the pulse of it," she'd say, pressing a glowing petal into a mortar. "It's alive, same as the sage. It'll tell you what it needs." The apprentices listened, their hands steadying with each passing season, and Clara felt a swell of pride whenever she passed by, knowing Ruth was keeping the old ways alive. Jacob Miller had found his place too, His broad shoulders now bent over the portals as their keeper. His silver pendant, once a warning, had evolved into a tool, its light syncing with the doorways, ensuring their stability. He'd trained a few of the hunter's sons to help, their wary eyes softening as they learned the rhythm of the other world. Jacob rarely spoke of that night 5 years back, but Clara saw it in the way he watched her. Half protector, half brother, a bond forged in the fire of her choice. He'd grown into a man of quiet strength, his chestnut hair streaked with early gray, and she relied on him more than she'd admit. The Shadow Walkers hadn't vanished entirely. True to their word, they'd left a thread, a hum Clara felt in her bones, and sometimes they crossed back, their silver-blue forms gliding through the portals with a grace that still took her breath away. That morning a small group had arrived, young ones by their reckoning, their golden eyes wide with curiosity as they stepped into Willow Hollow. They moved like liquid light, their claws clicking softly on the ground. And Clara greeted them with a nod, her golden gaze meeting theirs in silent understanding. They'd come to learn, they said through sensations rather than words, images of crystalline halls and starry skies replaced by the earthy sprawl of the hollow, a trade of knowledge she'd bargained for. "They're like kids," Jacob remarked, leaning against a porch post as he watched them explore the garden, their shadows mingling with the pines. "Reckon they want to know what makes us tick." Clara smiled, brushing a strand of starlight hair from her face. "Good," she said, her voice resonating with that otherworldly echo. "We've got plenty to teach 'em, and plenty to learn." She felt the thread pulse, a lifeline that kept the worlds close, and knew it was working. Slowly, steadily, a harmony she'd never dreamed possible. But harmony wasn't without its cracks. Some folks still whispered in the church pews, their voices low with unease about the things in their midst. Margaret, now frailer but no less sharp, mediated the grumbles, her scrolls a testament to the prophecy fulfilled. "Give it time," she'd say, her tone firm. "Clara's made us something more'n we were." And most listened, drawn by the garden's healing light, the cures Lillian shared, the quiet wonder of a town touched by magic. Clara knelt by a hybrid plant, its petals glowing faintly, and felt a pang of longing for the girl she'd been, free of golden eyes and cosmic threads. She missed the simplicity of mending a bird's wing, the quiet of a night without the hum of portals in her mind. But then she heard Lillian's laugh from the kitchen, saw Henry's steady hand sketching at the table, and the pang faded. She'd lost something, sure, but she'd gained more, a family whole again, a town reborn. The young shadow walkers gathered around her, their golden eyes curious, and she stood brushing dirt from her jeans. "Come on," she said, her voice warm despite its echo. "Let's show you what grows here." They followed, their light blending with hers, and Clara felt the balance settle deeper. A fragile, beautiful thing she'd fight to keep. The hollow was hers, and she was its bridge, and whatever lay ahead, she'd face it with the strength of those who'd come before her. 100 years had woven their threads into the tapestry of Willow Hollow, and on this crisp autumn evening, the town glowed with a light that defied the encroaching dusk. The sun dipped below the Appalachian ridges, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, while crystalline spires, grown tall alongside the old clapboard houses, caught the fading rays in a symphony of rainbows. Portals pulsed softly at the town's edges, their stable glow a testament to Clara Hensley's century-old choice. and the air hummed with a blend of earthly pine and the sweet, alien fragrance of the Shadow Walker's realm. Tonight was the centennial celebration, a grand festival marking the day Clara became the bridge, and Willow Hollow buzzed with life, human and otherworldly alike. Clara stood on the porch of her stone house, her starlight hair flowing in the breeze, her golden eyes reflecting the town's transformation. The patterns of frost and shadow on her skin shimmered faintly, a living mark of her dual existence, and the golden star on her forehead blazed with a quiet intensity. She was timeless now, her body untouched by the years, a bridge who walked between worlds with a grace that had grown as natural as breathing. The herb garden sprawled before her, its hybrid blooms chiming in the wind, earthly roses twining with crystalline flowers, their light a beacon for the celebration unfolding in the town square. The square itself was a marvel, a blend of past and present that would have stunned the Willow Hollow of Clara's youth. Children darted through the crowd, some with golden eyes and shimmering skin, born of unions between humans and shadow walkers, a new generation that knew no fear of difference. They laughed and danced, their voices mingling with the soft hum of crystalline instruments played by the town's musicians, while banners of woven shadow and light fluttered overhead. Tables groaned under platters of cornbread, venison stew, and glowing fruits from the other realm, their sweetness a gift from the shadow walkers who'd crossed through for the night. Clara stepped into the throng, her boots crunching on gravel now laced with frost, and felt the weight of a century settle over her, not heavy, but warm, like a quilt stitched with the memories. Henry and Lillian were gone now, their mortal years spent in quiet joy after their return, their legacy carried in the healing gardens and the stories they'd left behind. Jacob Miller's descendants thrived as portal keepers, their silver pendants a faint echo of his own, and Ruth's apprentices had grown into a guild of healers whose cures reached beyond the hollow. But Clara remained, the constant thread, her golden eyes a beacon for a town that had learned to dance with the unknown. Elder Sarah Cole, Margaret's granddaughter, now stooped with age but sharp as ever, stood on a wooden platform, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "A century ago," she said, her gray hair catching the crystalline light, "our ancestors feared what they didn't understand. But one soul, Clara Hensley, chose compassion over fear and gave us this." She gestured to the portals, the hybrid children, the glowing spires, and the crowd cheered, their voices a chorus of gratitude that warmed Clara's heart. The shadow walkers joined the celebration, their silver-blue forms gliding through the square, their golden eyes wide with wonder at the mortal world they'd come to know. Some were young, born after the Exodus, eager to see the land their kin had once been bound to, while others were ancients, their presence heavy with the weight of millennia. They moved with liquid grace, their claws clicking softly, and Clara greeted them with a nod, feeling the thread she'd demanded pulse stronger tonight, a lifeline that had held through 100 years of harmony. A group of hybrid children approached her, their hands clutching crystalline flowers that chimed with each step. "Miss Clara." A girl with golden eyes and auburn curls said, her voice bright, "We made these for you, to say thank you." Clara knelt, accepting the blooms with a smile, their light blending with her own. "They're beautiful," she said, her voice resonating with that otherworldly echo. "Just like you." The children beamed, darting off to join a dance where human steps mingled with shadow light swirls, a sight that would have been impossible a century ago. But harmony wasn't without its shadows. As the night deepened, a delegation of shadow walkers approached, led by an ancient whose form shimmered with streaks of midnight blue, its golden eyes deep with purpose. "Clara Hensley," it said, its chorus of voices cutting through the music. "We bring a proposal to widen the bridge, to deepen the thread between our worlds. More of us would cross, and more of you might visit our realm. A union greater than before." The words hung in the air, a ripple of possibility that stilled the crowd. Clara felt the thread hum, her golden eyes narrowing as she weighed the offer. Jacob's great-grandson, Daniel Miller, stepped forward, his pendant glowing faintly, his dark eyes wary. "That's a big ask," he said, his voice steady but edged with caution. "We've kept balance this long, why risk it now?" Murmurs spread through the townsfolk, some nodding, others frowning, and Clara saw the old fears flicker in their faces. Fears her choice had quieted but never fully erased. Sarah Cole raised a hand, her voice firm. "Let's hear 'em out," she said, her gaze shifting to Clara. "This is your bridge, Clara. What do you reckon?" All eyes turned to her, human and shadow walker alike, and she felt the weight of a century pressed down. Pride in what she'd built, unease at pushing it further. The shadow walker's proposal stirred something in her, a longing to see their realm fully, to walk those crystalline halls, but also a fear of losing the fragile peace she'd fought for. "I need to think on it," she said, her voice carrying over the square, steady despite the tremor in her heart. "This ain't just my choice, it's ours." The shadow walker inclined its head, accepting her delay, and the music resumed, though a thread of tension lingered in the air. Clara stepped back, her golden eyes scanning the crowd, children playing, healers tending a glowing garden, portal keepers watching the doorways, and wondered if harmony could stretch further without breaking. As the night wore on, a young hybrid boy tugged at her sleeve, his golden eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Clara," he asked, "is it true you started all this with a wolf pup?" She smiled, kneeling to meet his gaze, and felt the past rush back. The mist of pine-whispering woods, the jolt of that first touch, the choice that had changed everything. "It's true," she said, her voice soft, "and it's why we're here tonight. 'Cause sometimes helping one little thing can help us all." The boy grinned, darting off, and Clara stood, her heart full but restless, knowing the celebration was only a pause before the next step. 100 years had woven their threads into the tapestry of Willow Hollow, and on this crisp autumn evening the town glowed with a light that defied the encroaching dusk. The sun dipped below the Appalachian ridges, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, while crystalline spires, grown tall alongside the old clapboard houses, caught the fading rays in a symphony of rainbows. Portals pulsed softly at the town's edges, their stable glow a testament to Clara Hensley's century-old choice, and the air hummed with a blend of earthly pine and the sweet alien fragrance of the shadow walker's realm. Tonight was the centennial celebration, a grand festival marking the day Clara became the bridge, and Willow Hollow buzzed with life, human and otherworldly alike. Clara stood in the porch of her stone house, her starlight hair flowing in the breeze, her golden eyes reflecting the town's transformation. The patterns of frost and shadow on her skin shimmered faintly, a living mark of her dual existence, and the golden star on her forehead blazed with a quiet intensity. She was timeless now, her body untouched by the years, a bridge who walked between worlds with a grace that had grown as natural as breathing. The herb garden sprawled before her, its hybrid blooms chiming in the wind, earthly roses twining with crystalline flowers, their light a beacon for the celebration unfolding in the town square. The square itself was a marvel, a blend of past and present that would have stunned the willow hollow of Clara's youth. Children darted through the crowd, some with golden eyes and shimmering skin, born of unions between humans and shadow walkers, a new generation that knew no fear of difference. They laughed and danced, their voices mingling with the soft hum of crystalline instruments played by the town's musicians, while banners of woven shadow and light fluttered overhead. Tables groaned under platters of cornbread, venison stew, and glowing fruits from the other realm, their sweetness a gift from the shadow walkers who'd crossed through for the night. Clara stepped into the throng, her boots crunching on gravel now laced with frost, and felt the weight of a century settle over her, not heavy, but warm, like a quilt stitched with memories. Henry and Lillian were gone now, their mortal years spent in quiet joy after their return, their legacy carried in the healing gardens and the stories they'd left behind. Jacob Miller's descendants thrived as portal keepers, their silver pendants a faint echo of his own, and Ruth's apprentices had grown into a guild of healers whose cures reached beyond the hollow. But Clara remained, the constant thread, her golden eyes a beacon for a town that had learned to dance with the unknown. Elder Sarah Cole, Margaret's granddaughter, now stooped with age but sharp as ever, stood on a wooden platform, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "A century ago," she said, her gray hair catching the crystalline light, "our ancestors feared what they didn't understand. But one soul, Clara Hensley, chose compassion over fear and gave us this." She gestured to the portals, the hybrid children, the glowing spires, and the crowd cheered, their voices a chorus of gratitude that warmed Clara's heart. The shadow walkers joined the celebration, their silver blue forms gliding through the square, their golden eyes wide with wonder at the mortal world they'd come to know. Some were young, born after the Exodus, eager to see the land their kin had once been bound to, while others were ancients, their presence heavy with the weight of millennia. They moved with liquid grace, their claws clicking softly, and Clara greeted them with a nod, feeling the thread she'd demanded pulse stronger tonight, a lifeline that had held through 100 years of harmony. A group of hybrid children approached her, their hands clutching crystalline flowers that chimed with each step. "Miss Clara," a girl with golden eyes and auburn curls said, her voice bright, "we made these for you, to say thank you." Clara knelt, accepting the blooms with a smile, their light blending with her own. "They're beautiful," she said, her voice resonating with that otherworldly echo. "Just like you." The children beamed, darting off to join a dance where human steps mingled with shadow light swirls, a sight that would have been impossible a century ago. But harmony wasn't without its shadows. As the night deepened, a delegation of shadow walkers approached, led by an ancient whose form shimmered with streaks of midnight blue, its golden eyes deep with purpose. "Clara Hensley," it said, its chorus of voices cutting through the music. "We bring a proposal to widen the bridge, to deepen the thread between our worlds. More of us would cross, and more of you might visit our realm, a union greater than before." The words hung in the air, a ripple of possibility that stilled the crowd. Clara felt the thread hum, her golden eyes narrowing as she weighed the offer. Jacob's great-grandson, Daniel Miller, stepped forward. his pendant glowing faintly, his dark eyes wary. "That's a big ask," he said, his voice steady but edged with caution. "We've kept balance this long. Why risk it now?" Murmurs spread through the townsfolk, some nodding, others frowning, and Clara saw the old fears flicker in their faces, fears her choice had quieted but never fully erased. Sarah Cole raised a hand, her voice firm. "Let's hear 'em out," she said, her gaze shifting to Clara. "This is your bridge, Clara. What do you reckon?" All eyes turned to her, human and shadow walker alike, and she felt the weight of a century press down. Pride in what she'd built, unease at pushing it further. The shadow walker's proposal stirred something in her. A longing to see their realm fully, to walk those crystalline halls, but also a fear of losing the fragile peace she'd fought for. "I need to think on it," she said, her voice carrying over the square, steady despite the tremor in her heart. "This ain't just my choice, it's ours." The shadow walker inclined its head, accepting her delay, and the music resumed, though a thread of tension lingered in the air. Clara stepped back, her golden eyes scanning the crowd, children playing, healers tending a glowing garden, portal keepers watching the doorways, and wondered if harmony could stretch further without breaking. As the night wore on, a young hybrid boy tugged at her sleeve, his golden eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Clara," he asked, "is it true you started all this with a wolf pup?" She smiled, kneeling to meet his gaze, and felt the past rush back. The mist of pine whispering woods, the jolt of that first touch, the choice that had changed everything. "It's true," she said, her voice soft, "and it's why we're here tonight, 'cause sometimes helping one little thing can help us all." The boy grinned, darting off, and Clara stood, her heart full but restless, knowing the celebration was only a pause before the next step. 2 centuries had reshaped Willow Hollow into a place where time and space bent in quiet reverence to Clara Hensley's legacy. The autumn evening stretched long and golden over the town, now a hub of intersecting realms, its streets a blend of earthy gravel and crystalline path that shimmered underfoot. The portals stood taller, their edges etched with frost and shadow, doorways to a crystalline world that sang with every breeze. The pines of pine whispering woods loomed higher, their branches wreathed in delicate crystal formations, a sacred grove where the boundaries between worlds were celebrated rather than feared. Clara walked its edge, her starlight hair flowing like a river, her golden eyes reflecting universes, her skin a canvas of shifting runes that told the story of her bridge. She was no longer just Clara, not in the way she'd been 200 years ago, a girl with a knack for healing critters. She was the light between worlds, a timeless figure whose presence held the realms in balance, her body a conduit for the thread she'd forged. The golden mark on her forehead had multiplied into a constellation, each star a point of connection to the Shadow Walker's realm, and her voice carried echoes of both worlds, resonant and eternal. She moved with a grace that transcended mortality, her boots leaving faint trails of frost on the mossy earth, and felt the hum of the portals like a second heartbeat. Willow Hollow had grown into a marvel, a city of stone and crystal where hybrid children played with shadow-light toys, their laughter blending earthly warmth with crystalline clarity. Healers tended vast gardens of hybrid plants, their cures reaching beyond the hollow to other towns, even other realms. Portal keepers, descendants of Jacob Miller, watched the doorways with pendants that glowed in harmony with Clara's essence, their dark eyes steady as they guided travelers between worlds. Henry and Lillian's legacy lived on in the libraries they'd founded, books of shadow and light that taught the young ones the history of the bridge, while Ruth's guild had spread, its healers a bridge of their own between mortal and magic. That evening, Clara stood beneath the ancient oak where it all began, its trunk now a towering nexus of earth and crystal, its branches heavy with fruit that glowed like stars. A group of young shadow walkers emerged from a nearby portal, their silver-blue forms fluid and bright, their golden eyes wide with awe as they stepped into the grove. They were students, sent to learn of the mortal world, as mortals studied theirs, a trade that had deepened over decades. Clara greeted them with a nod, feeling the thread pulse, and sensed their curiosity, a hunger to understand the earth that had once bound their kin. "You've come far," she said, her voice resonating through the grove. And the shadow walkers responded with sensations, images of crystalline halls, gratitude for the bridge she'd built. She guided them through the woods, showing them the pines, the streams, the quiet beauty of a world they'd once known only as exile, and felt a quiet pride in the exchange. But pride wasn't all she carried. The centuries had stretched her thin, her connection to both realms, a constant pull that left little room for the girl she'd been. She missed her parents' voices, Jacob's steady presence, the simplicity of a life without golden eyes. Yet she bore it, knowing the harmony she'd forged was worth the cost, until a new challenge arose. A ripple shook the portals, a tremor that vibrated through the thread, and Clara's golden eyes narrowed as she turned toward the town. A shadow walker elder materialized beside her, its form streaked with midnight blue, its voice urgent. "A realm collapses," it said, its chorus sharp with alarm. "One of ours, distant but tied to us. Without aid its fall will strain the bridge, your bridge." Clara felt it then. A tear in the fabric, a distant cry echoing through her senses, and knew she couldn't ignore it. She moved swiftly, her starlight hair trailing behind her as she entered Willow Hollow, the townsfolk parting with murmurs of awe. Daniel Miller's grandson, Elias, joined her, his pendant glowing, his dark eyes sharp with the instincts of a keeper. "What's happenin'?" he asked, and Clara explained, her voice steady despite the weight. Together they approached the central portal, its edges crackling with energy, and she reached through the thread, her power stretching across dimensions to touch the collapsing realm, crystalline spires crumbling, shadow beings fading into dust. Clara poured herself into it, her golden eyes blazing as she wove the thread tighter, stabilizing the realm with a surge of light and shadow. The effort drained her, her knees buckling, but Elias caught her, his pendant sinking with her essence, a lifeline that held her steady. The portal calmed, the distant realm saved, and Clara felt the gratitude of its beings, a faint echo of thanks that warmed her weary heart. As she straightened, a hybrid girl approached, her golden eyes bright with wonder, her auburn hair a mirror of Clara's past. "Miss Clara," she asked, clutching a crystalline flower, "is it true you started this with a wolf pup?" The question pulled Clara back, the memory sharp and vivid, the mist, the jolt, the choice. And she smiled, kneeling to meet the girl's gaze. "It's true," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "One little act can change everything, and it's why I'm here, helping still." The girl beamed, darting off, and Clara rose, her golden eyes flickering with nostalgia. She'd saved a realm tonight, as she'd saved her own 2 centuries ago, and the thread held strong, but she felt the end nearing, a quiet call to rest after centuries of service. Elias watched her, his pendant dimming, and murmured, "You're tired, ain't you?" She nodded, her smile bittersweet, and knew the next step, whatever it was, would be her last. The grove whispered around her, the oak a silent witness, and Clara felt the past and future converge, readying her for the closure she'd soon seek. Below is Chapter 12 of The Whispering Pines of Willow Hollow, approximately 800 words written in American English with third-person omniscient narration. This chapter serves as the definitive conclusion, closing the narrative with emotional resolution and thematic fulfillment. It connects seamlessly to chapters 1 through 11, tying up Clara's journey and the town's legacy in a way that resonates with your target audience's love for family, compassion, and closure. The autumn evening settled over Willow Hollow with a gentle stillness, the golden light of dusk softening the edges of a town that had grown beyond its earthly roots. 300 years had passed since Clara Hensley first reached out to a silver-gray wolf pup in pine whispering woods. And now the ancient oak at the forest edge stood as a monument to her choice, a towering nexus of earth and crystal, its branches laden with glowing fruit that cast a warm radiance over the grove. The air hummed with the faint pulse of portals, their stable glow a testament to the bridge she'd forged, and the pines whispered a quiet song, their needles shimmering with frost despite the season's warmth. Tonight Clara stood beneath the oak, her starlight hair flowing softly, her golden eyes dim with a weariness earned over centuries. She was the light between worlds no longer, just Clara, a woman whose compassion had reshaped reality itself. Her skin bore the familiar patterns of frost and shadow, though they flickered faintly now, and the constellation of golden marks on her forehead pulsed with a fading light. Around her gathered the last of her kin, Elias Miller, gray-haired and steady, his pendant a soft glow, Ruth's final apprentice, a healer named Mary, her hands cradling a bundle of hybrid herbs, and a handful of hybrid children, their golden eyes wide with reverence. Shadow walkers stood among them, their silver-blue forms shimmering in the dusk, their presence a silent farewell to the bridge who'd brought them home. Clara's gaze swept the grove, then settled on the oak, its roots curling into the earth like an embrace. She'd saved a realm 2 centuries ago, held the worlds in balance through countless seasons. But the thread she'd woven, her lifeline between realms, had stretched her thin. Henry and Lillian had passed long ago, their mortal lives a gift she'd cherished, and Jacob's lineage thrived in the portal keepers who'd followed her lead. Willow Hollow was no longer hers to carry alone. It belonged to the generations she'd shaped, human and hybrid alike, a harmony forged in her name. "I've carried this long enough," she said, her voice soft but resonant, echoing through the grove with the weight of 300 years. "It's time to rest." Elias stepped forward, his dark eyes glistening, and rested a hand on her shoulder. "You've given us everything, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Ain't no one could have done more." The Shadow Walker elder who'd first crossed her path materialized beside her, its golden eyes swirling with gratitude. "You chose us," it said, its chorus of voices a gentle hymn. "And in choosing, you mended what was broken. The thread will hold without you now." Clara nodded, feeling the truth in its words. The portal's stable, the world's balanced, her legacy secure in the hands of those who had learned from her compassion. She turned to the oak, her hand brushing its crystal-wrought bark, and felt a pull, a call to merge with the tree that had witnessed her beginning. "Take me home," she whispered, and the oak responded, its branches glowing brighter as light flowed from her into its roots. Her starlight hair dissolved into a cascade of sparks, her golden eyes dimmed to a soft ember, and the patterns on her skin faded into the tree's grain, a final mark of her presence. She sank into it, her form dissolving in a burst of frost and shadow, and the grove trembled, the air singing with a melody of both worlds. The crowd watched in silence as Clara vanished, her essence absorbed by the oak, its fruit blazing with a light that bathed Willow Hollow in warmth. The portals dimmed but held, a symbol of her eternal bond, and the shadow walkers bowed their heads, their silver-blue forms fading back to their realm. Elias knelt by the tree, his pendant dark, and whispered, "Rest well, Clara." Mary scattered her herbs at its base, a healer's blessing, and the children sang a soft tune, their voices blending earthly warmth with crystalline clarity. Willow Hollow mourned, then rejoiced, its people gathering beneath the oak to tell her story. A girl who'd helped a pup and changed the worlds. The tree stood as her legacy, a quiet sentinel over a town where compassion had triumphed over fear. And as night fell, its light promised that Clara's rest was eternal, her bridge forever woven into the heart of the hollow. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.